This is Jimbo Jaytech back with video 12 here on Sonic Academy. Today we are looking at EQ and compression, something that I have tried to use as little as possible in this project. So I'm going to explore that with you as to why and how, as well as give you really my most sage pieces of advice when it comes to both EQ and compression. So let's dive right in. My general approach to and by processing I mean EQ and compression, of course. My general approach is finish the song as much as humanly possible without processing to begin with. And that goes for spatial processing too. I like to keep things pretty dry. Your processing ideally should be celebrating and supporting and just spicing up the elements in your track. It shouldn't be saving them, and it shouldn't be the foundation upon which your whole mix is built. British chef Jamie Oliver said something which I really loved. He said, "I do as little to my ingredients as humanly possible to make them really pop and celebrate them." And I think that that rings true for processing as well. So we're going to start with EQ. And there's just one question that I want you to ask yourself when you're EQing elements in your track. And that is, where is everything hitting in the frequency spectrum? So as some of you might already know, most sounds have a really identifiable fundamental frequency. We talked a little bit about this with the snare earlier in the track, and I mentioned that this snare was hitting at 210K. So there's that crispiness to the treble and that punch in the gut of the 200 hertz. So these, these snare sounds often have really a couple of fundamental frequencies. Not always, it depends on the sound. The kick is interesting because it hits all the way across the frequency spectrum. So with our kick drums, we're not necessarily trying to make it featured at any one point in the song, although we can sort of bring out certain points. But most everything else, including polyphonic sounds, have a fundamental frequency where things hit. And I'll give you an example of what that looks like. So let's take this vocal, for example. Now, before I do this, I'm going to suggest that there is a correlation between where things are on the frequency spectrum and where you feel it in your body. So that's a question I'm often asking myself is, where am I feeling this sound in my body? I mentioned that at 200 hertz is like a punch in the gut. This 1 to 2 kilohertz range is sort of the face. It's the throat, it's the vocal, it's the mouth part of the face. This is the part of the song that ideally should be talking to you. If you listen to a pop song on the radio and you're listening to it on a little speaker, there might be all kinds of music going on, but the vocal is going to be coming at you here. And so this is sort of the front and center stage in a lot of songs. It's the place where the center of the message is coming from, even if it's not necessarily the center of gravity in the frequency spectrum. There's also a mono space component. So, vocals are often hitting you here and in mono, and that is the front and center stage of the song. So where are things hitting? And you'd be amazed how often people will actually leave this part blank in a song and have lots of bassy stuff going on and lots of trebly stuff going on, but they're actually leaving this part blank because they're actually sort of afraid to sort of put their best foot forward, and they're afraid maybe a little bit musically to say, "Hello world, this is me. I'm telling you my musical message and you have to deal with it, and I'm not apologizing for it." That's sort of this area, right? So, an EQ, when you turn things up on an EQ, it's telling your speakers to send out more powerful vibrations of those frequencies, which are hitting your listeners in a certain way. And if EQ is being used incorrectly in your song, what it means is that your song is literally vibrating your listeners in the wrong place. And, often it's just a case of nudging things in the right direction. So I'm just going to play this sound. Solo it out, of course. So just like in a previous video, we were talking about how there's the whole, mix, and then there's the music that is sort of the thing that's shining out over the top of everything else. It's the same with every individual sound. There's a fundamental frequency. And you can see I've got this keyboard down here, which sort of shows that, every frequency is really like a note on the keyboard. The notes on the keyboard are sort of these defined barriers between different frequencies. And if you put something at, say, C sharp, it's got a frequency of 69 hertz down here. And if you double that frequency, it takes you up an octave. So we're actually placing things, in the frequency spectrum, and we're having fundamental frequencies for things. And if you don't already, I would suggest just, trying to find these. It's sometimes kind of easy to get them wrong, but it's not a huge deal, and actually label them, and actually label where they're hitting in the frequency spectrum. And what you might find, because these same frequencies will come up again and again, because you are, inadvertently sort of placing things in the same places again and again in the frequency spectrum. What you might find is that you have two sounds playing at the same time with the same fundamental frequency, and then you might sort of realize that they're actually competing for the same place on the stage. So where are things hitting? Where do you feel it in your body? When you boost this 200 hertz on this snare, there's more of a sort of visceral reaction, and especially if you're like, at a rave or a club on a big sound system, your body is also literally being like hit by these powerful frequencies. Those bass frequencies will be shaking you, literally. So, one fun mix technique is to sort of, like identify where you want things to hit on the frequency spectrum. And then you can even give things a little bump at their fundamental frequency if you want them to pop through there a little bit more. And it's a way to sort of stack things from left to right on the frequency spectrum in a way that they all have their own little space where they shine through. Not all sounds need to be bumped up at their fundamental frequencies. Sometimes they already are by default. So the more that you EQ things and the more that you process things, the less genuine they become. The harder they have to work to sound authentic. So this is why you want to try and get everything to sit as right as possible with your sound selection and with your volume first. So something to think about. The other end of that, the other side of that coin is asking yourself, where am I feeling this in my body too much? So I'll give you an example of that. Say with a tambourine. This is already quite a shrill and piercing sound to begin with. And, I'm not going to boost this too much because I don't want to hurt your ears out there. But say, I brought the sound in and it sounded like this to begin with. In my headphones right now, I'm feeling that too much in my head. It's like between my ears. I'm feeling it in my brain. And it's sort of like, it's not a nice feeling. So I'm sort of, I might pull back on that. Or at least pull it back down to where it was so that it's not I'm not feeling it too much in the wrong places. So really think about it from a visceral perspective, about like where you want your listener to be feeling these things and where they're placed. And if you want a good indicator of where things should hit, a lot of these EQ plugins actually sort of give you some sort of good guides, and you do see these things doubling up again and again and again, like this Waves Q10 EQ here. It really does it gives you a bit of an indicator, I'd say I put kicks around the sort of 50 to 60 hertz, basses are 80 to 100. The body of the bass is usually sort of in this lower mid range. And, so you've got these ranges that you can place things. And, if you can sort of think about that and just nudge things ever so slightly in the right way, you'll have success. Compression, there's only one thing I'm going to say about compression, because I feel like I should go do like a whole series of mix videos at some point, is, how much compression should you have in your song? And it's a hard question to answer because some tracks call for virtually no compression, and then others, you have compression on every single little thing. But the way that I like to look at compression, firstly, the settings are a little bit more forgiving than EQs. So if you're not really sure like what settings you should be dialing in on like an individual compressor, my suggestion would be just make sure they're not too tight. And that's like a tight compressor there. And if it's, and that threshold, you want to let your sounds breathe. So, use some moderate compression settings and, your song will be fairly forgiving if you're just using a splash here and there. But the most important question is how much compression should there be in the whole song? And the answer to that is, it depends if your song is a work of non-fiction or if it's a work of fiction. With my tracks, I'm generally telling a pretty honest message. You know, I definitely like to ham things up a little bit and, you know, make things sound larger than life. But most of what I'm saying with my music is a true story. And so for that reason, I can leave things, you know, pretty much as they are a lot of the time, unless, you know, something in the mix is calling, you know, for it to be adjusted. If I want to, you know, stretch things out with compression and sort of, you know, blow them up and amplify them and make them sound a bit larger than life, the sound becomes a little bit less genuine. And there are some, you know, super compressed, super squished pop songs where it's a total work of fiction and the artist is portraying a version of themselves that isn't necessarily who they really are. It's performing a role. It's acting. So, you know, my suggestion to you is, once again, finish the mix as if the label were asking you to have no EQ or compression whatsoever. You know, nudge those EQs around a little bit just so that things hit in the right place and so that you're feeling things in the right place. And then with compression, you know, really ask yourself how much compression you want in the whole song, and don't be afraid to just put it in certain places. You can put a little bit of compression on everything in the whole song if that's how you want to, if you want to play it, or you can have a mostly dry song where just a couple of elements have the absolute crap squished out of them. And then you've still got that element of compression in the song, and that'll help give it a sort of commercial feel, help give it a radio feel without necessarily busying up the whole mix. So that wraps it up for, you know, this quite concise, you know, thoughts on EQ and compression. And once again, it's because I only use a splash of them here and there throughout this whole song to make everything shine. In the next video, we're going to talk about preparing your track for mastering before it goes to press. So stay tuned.